Welcome, listener. This is Sebastian Nothwell here to introduce you to the 8th chapter of my gay Victorian fae romance, Oak King, Holly King, as narrated by Gary Furlong. Enjoy!
Chapter 8. Wren seized the window frame and thrust his upper half out into the night, where Butcher had gone. The fog swallowed up all trace of him. Wren doubted he could see his own hand if he waved it in front of his face, much less the cobblestones 3 stories below. As said thick, caustic, choking fog had begun seeping into the garret, Wren retreated and shut the window, though not without reluctance. He'd had half a mind to leap into the night after Butcher. Even now his heart flung itself at his ribs like a caged finch determined to escape. His fingers yet trembled with the thrill as he fumbled the window lock. It took considerable resolve for him to shut the curtain. The blue fey flame hovering over his quilt guttered and went out. Wren took this to mean Butcher had left Staple Inn. He lit a candle at his desk in its stead, though while a candle might replace the will-o'-the-wisp, nothing could replace Butcher. Wren sat down hard on the quilt where the fey flame had flickered, where Butcher himself had sprawled not an hour past. Now alone, Wren brought his fingertips to his mouth to touch the ghost of Butcher's kiss. His lips yet tingled with it. So too did the mark blooming on his throat where Butcher had torn open his collar. The fury of Wren's repressed desires had overtaken him in the moment, had allowed him not only to submit to the embrace, but to return it in force. He knew he ought to feel appalled at his own audacity. But rather than dread, his heart pounded with elation. He'd long ago given up on his dreams of kissing another man, instead transferring his desires to the heroes and villains of his manuscripts and illustrations. Until tonight, when, incredibly, his first kiss in more years than he cared to count had exceeded all his considerable expectations. He felt as if a decade's weight had lifted off his shoulder and made him a young university student again, his aspirations not yet snuffed out. Even now, with so long and grim a conversation between the first kiss and the last, the thought of either proved enough to stir Wren's prick to half-mast. Wren knew the recollection would drive him to onanism long before Samhain, likely more than once. For the moment, however, he would have to draw on 20 years of resolve to turn his mind towards more pressing needs. The first order of business, after Butcher had vanished into the fog, was to find a new hiding place for his manuscripts. The desk had proved too obvious. It did, however, make a convenient perch for Wren to climb on as he stretched up into the rafters to search for some place better. Unfortunately, the stark white of the paper appeared far too visible against the dark wooden beams, no matter how deep a shadow he tucked them into. He went over the chimney brick by brick as he came down, but found none loose. Only when he slid under his own bed to try stuffing the manuscripts between the ropes holding up his mattress did he discover, quite by accident, a solution. While crawling on his back, he struck his left elbow sharp against a floorboard and heard a curiously hollow thud. Despite the pain and numbness spreading down his arm to his fingertips, he felt along the edge of the board, and after much more crawling, writhing, cursing, and the retrieval of a letter opener from his desk, pried it up. Beneath it lay the crossboard supporting the floor above and ceiling below, and plenty of space between them, some 6 inches deep. More than enough room for his papers, which he stashed inside. Dawn had broken by the time Wren finished hiding his sins, which was just as well, as he didn't think he could sleep a wink after the night he'd had. The passing of a quarter hour saw him scrubbed, brushed, and wearing a fresh shirt beneath his suit. In another quarter hour he had tea boiling on the copper kettle downstairs and stood before the fire with bread on a toasting fork in one hand and a pan of sausages in the other. His aborted educational career had taught him, amongst other things, the art of cookery outside of kitchens. By 7 o'clock, the first round of the penny post had arrived, along with the morning edition of the Times. Wren arranged it on the breakfast tray alongside the buttered toast, tea, and sausages, and set the whole down on Mr. Grigsby's desk. 5 minutes later, punctual to the minute, Mr. Grigsby himself descended the stair to the office. "Good morning, Lofthouse," Mr. Grigsby said as he approached his desk, much like every other morning for the past decade. Today, however, he paused just before sitting down and shot Wren a questioning glance. Wren froze. He kept his subservient mask on, barely, while panic raced through his mind. His heart stopped as he recalled the bruise Butcher had kissed onto his throat. He had thought his cravat covered it, but if it had slipped since then— "Are you feeling quite the thing, Lofthouse?" Mr. Grigsby asked. He sounded more concerned than disapproving. Wren tried to take heart in that. "Quite well, sir," Wren lied. "Thank you." Mr. Grigsby professed himself happy to hear it, adding, "It's only, if you'll forgive my saying so, you don't look as if you've slept well." Wren had grown so accustomed to the blue bruises under his own eyes that he hadn't noticed they appeared much deeper than usual this morning. "Bit of a headache, sir. Gone now." Mr. Grigsby again declared his delight in learning this, and more importantly, finally sat down and distracted himself with breakfast. The rest of the day ran on in much the same manner as the thousands of unremarkable days that had passed before it, with the exception that Wren did a great deal more surreptitious scrawling in his notebook behind the stacks of ledgers, and towards a greater purpose. A multitude of potential magical sigils poured forth from his pen. Invented instructions for occult rituals flowed alongside them, his cramped hand producing increasingly arcane notes as he went. Amidst all of this occurred several attempted portraits of Butcher himself. Tall, dark, and handsome, high cheekbones, aquiline nose, dagger-point ears, dark eyes in whose depths one could drown in and delight in drowning, sometimes in statuesque posture with an entirely invented sword such as appeared on the tombs of kings, and sometimes sprawled across gnarled tree branches like Robin Hood with his shapely limbs displayed to their best effect, and sometimes brooding beneath his heavy cloak with its tattered edges like raven's feathers, but always invoking a spark of desire in Wren's heart. Mr. Grigsby could be counted on to notice none of this, for which he had Wren's silent and undying gratitude. Thus the fortnight until Samhain flew by. The morning of the final day of October dawned with the same dull grey fog that heralded every morning in London. Unlike most days, however, it did not rain, which Wren took as a sign of good fortune. The hours crawled past. Wren drew many a marginal snail in between his clerking duties, light as ever, and his final furtive designs for the Samhain ritual. At 8 o'clock, Mr. Grigsby arose from his desk to go out to dinner. Wren tried to sound disinterested yet not ungrateful as he declined his master's customary invitation to join him. Inside, he felt as if 1,000 fireflies flew through his blood. He thought only of dashing to Hyde Park the instant Mr. Grigsby left the office. But just as Mr. Grigsby retrieved his walking stick from the umbrella stand, the downstairs bell rang, and all Wren's eager excitement withered into bitter anxiety. "Goodness," Mr. Grigsby remarked. "It's a very late hour for business. I hope nothing's amiss." Wren withheld an irritated sigh as he shoved his sketches under an open ledger and tore himself away from his desk to answer the door. No doubt Felix had returned for a second attempt at an advance on his trust fund, or Tolhurst had come to hear another report on his nephew's affairs. Wren opened the door ready to suffer through either of these interruptions. He had not prepared himself to come face to face with a girl. She appeared just as surprised to encounter him. Her blue eyes widened, their colour enhanced by the blue of her morning dress and the matching ribbons in her bonnet, from which a few golden ringlets escaped to frame her milk-white face. She could not have seen more than 16 summers, and all spent in luxury, judging by the lace trim on her hems and gloves. Bizarre that a girl should venture into Staple Inn. Still more bizarre that she should come alone. Yet most bizarre of all, Wren thought he recognised her. "Miss Fairfield?" Wren ventured. Miss Flora Fairfield blinked back at him. "How Mr. Knoll carries your miniature," Wren hastened to explain. "He showed it to Mr. Grigsby and myself shortly after its completion." "Oh," she said. It occurred to Wren that nobody carried his miniature for Miss Flora to acquaint herself with prior to this meeting. "Forgive me, Lofthouse, Mr. Grigsby's clerk, at your service." "Oh," she said again, this time in recognition. "Yes, Mr. Lofthouse. Mr. Grigsby speaks very highly of you." Wren could not fathom how. "Miss Fairfield," came Mr. Grigsby's voice from within the office, and soon Mr. Grigsby himself appeared over Wren's shoulder. "Bless my soul, what a pleasant surprise! Come in, only—" he added, blinking past Miss Flora into the empty stairwell. "Surely you didn't come alone?" "I must," Miss Flora replied with admirable composure as she crossed the threshold. "I had no other way to reach you. I didn't wish to put matters into writing, lest they fall into other hands." Mr. Grigsby looked as confused by this as Wren felt. Yet he remained as amiable as ever as he ushered her into his chair and put the kettle on for tea. She perched on the edge of the seat and cast a wary look over the office as she untied her bonnet to reveal the same golden curls as her miniature portrait, though her rigid posture and unsmiling face, which accentuated all the hard lines of her shoulders and jaw, looked quite unlike her likeness. Wren had never expected to meet the girl in his life, but even so, she defied his expectations. "No, my dear," Mr. Grigsby said, just as if he addressed the meek and mild creature carried in Felix's locket, and not the proud yet anxious young person seated before him. "Do tell us all we may do for you in your time of need." She had, after all, come a rather long way to do so. Still, her eyes flicked toward Wren as she replied, "I would prefer to ask my questions in confidence." "You may trust my clerk with your life," Mr. Grigsby declared. Again. Wren, already halfway through his retreat to the staircase, turned on his heel and resumed standing by the mantel with his hands folded behind his back. Miss Flora glanced at him again. He ventured a comforting smile. She did not look comforted, but made no further objection to his presence in the office and returned her gaze to Mr. Grigsby. "I wish to know," she began, her words halting with consideration, "whether or not my inheritance is dependent on my marrying Felix." "Not at all," Mr. Grigsby replied after a moment's stunned silence. "You shall come into it in full when you come of age, which you may do this very spring by marrying Mr. Noel, but of course, if you prefer to wait, then you shall have full use of it on your 21st birthday." While this explanation was technically true, Wren privately supposed that what would actually come to pass was that Miss Flora's fortune would skip over her altogether and land straight in Felix's pockets, where it would pour out again like water through a sieve into the coffers of whichever gambling dens, whorehouses, and moneylenders he favoured. But Wren's opinion on the matter had not been asked, and so he did not give it out. "Now, my dear," Mr. Grigsby said to Miss Flora, his smile bespeaking his total ignorance of Wren's suppositions. "Is that all you wished to know?" "Not quite," Miss Flora admitted. "Is it true that, if I do not marry him, Felix will be ruined?" "Goodness, what a question!" Mr. Grigsby laughed, as much startled as amused. "My dear Miss Fairfield, whatever could have put such a notion into your head?" Miss Flora did not answer him. Wren kept his own suspicions to himself. At length Mr. Grigsby's mirth subsided. "In pecuniary terms, no," said Mr. Grigsby. "He is as well provided for as yourself." Miss Flora looked as though she had some opinions of her own about whether or not she was well provided for, but kept these thoughts to herself. "Though I dare say," Mr. Grigsby continued, "it may ruin him in his heart, as it might ruin any man to lose your affection." A wan smile graced Miss Flora's pale lips. "However," Mr. Grigsby went on, "if your affection for him is not sufficient to permit you to marry, then you might do him the least harm by breaking off the engagement sooner rather than later." Wren, surprised by the old bachelor's romantic acuity, gave Mr. Grigsby a sharp glance. Mr. Grigsby failed to notice it. "Is that your advice, sir?" Miss Flora asked. "It is," said Mr. Grigsby. "Provided, of course, that you do not feel the affection for him that a bride ought to feel for her bridegroom. Better to have a small portion of misery now, in the breaking of an engagement, rather than to drag out a much larger portion of misery over the course of an unhappy marriage. Not that I mean to suggest you are miserable, or that your future together would prove certain misery," Mr. Grigsby hastened to add. "I do not presume to know the mind of a young lady, much less how matters stand between you and Mr. Noel in particular. However, if you are uncertain as to the depth of your own feelings, I would suggest taking the matter up with the young gentleman himself." Wren blinked at Mr. Grigsby. Mr. Grigsby continued to take no notice of his astonished clerk. "Then," Miss Flora said, after considering Mr. Grigsby's advice for many moments, "I have just one more question." Mr. Grigsby gave her such a look of solemn readiness that Wren might have had to disguise his laugh with a hasty cough if 10 years in the man's service hadn't already inured him to Mr. Grigsby's innate and guileless comedy. "Do you know," Miss Flora asked, "where I might find a room to stay the night in London?" A deafening silence thundered down on the office. "Stay in London?" Mr. Grigsby echoed after an excruciating pause. "Yes," said Miss Flora, as if it were the most natural suggestion in the world for a girl of her station. "The hour draws late. and I don't think it wise for me to attempt to return to Miss Bailiwick's academy this evening. Her wrath, I fear, is still too fresh. The storm ought to clear by morning, and when I return to Rochester tomorrow afternoon, her relief will render her much happier to see me than if I were to arrive on her doorstep after dinner tonight." While Wren could not fault her reasoning, Mr. Grigsby appeared quite at a loss. Another awkward pause ensued. Wren cleared his throat. Both Miss Flora and Mr. Grigsby whirled to stare at him. Wren put on an apologetic smile. "I meant to inform you earlier, sir, but as it so happens, this evening I intend to visit a friend, and do not expect to return before tomorrow morning. As such, I will make no use of my garret tonight. While it cannot offer accommodations of the standard to which Miss Fairfield is accustomed, perhaps it may prove a suitable solution for our present predicament." The awkward pause resumed. "Visit a friend," Mr. Grigsby echoed. Then he clapped his hands in delight. "Splendid, Lofthouse! How wonderful! Who is your friend? No, I mustn't press you, of course. Only do give him my regards and hopes for many more such visits in the future. And how convenient for our purposes," he added, seeming to at last recall Miss Flora's presence. "For if you've no objections, Miss Fairfield—" "None at all," she said. Her astonishment turned to repressed amusement at Mr. Grigsby's reaction to Wren's scheme. Though, Wren noted, she didn't seem to mock Mr. Grigsby so much as share in his good humour, or at least find her own joy in knowing he'd found his. "Excellent," said Wren, and for once meant it. "Let me just tidy up a little, and then I'll be out of your way. Good night, Miss Fairfield, Mr. Grigsby." Wren didn't wait for their reply before he dashed up the 2 flights to his garret. Within a quarter hour he'd swept and dusted matters into some semblance of order. More importantly, he locked up his desk and ensured the worst of his creative efforts were hidden away in the hollow under the floorboards beneath his bed. He didn't think it would occur to Miss Flora to look for anything out of the ordinary. Still, he sprinkled some dust sweepings over that particular corner to make it appear disused. Then, packing candles, teaspoon, chalk, knife, matches, twine, pencils, and sketchbook into his satchel, he gave one final approving glance around the garret and fled downstairs. There he snatched up his hat and coat, handed his key over to a bewildered Miss Flora, and with a final good night, vanished into the fog of Staple Inn. Shrike waited beneath the statue of Achilles. He'd arrived at twilight and stood there ever since with his arms crossed as he leaned against the statue's plinth. Mortals flowed past him through the fog. Their gaze shot to his feathered cap and clung to his cloak, tunic, hose, and boots. The mortals who wore gowns and bonnets covered their gaping mouths with gloves or fluttering fans. Those who wore coats and trousers gawked with abandon. Most fell to whispering with their companions as they hurried on. Shrike paid them little heed. None of them were Lofthouse, and thus their opinions mattered not. As the daylight dwindled, the gowns vanished and most of the trousers passed through alone. They did not hurry on like those who'd come before. They wandered, meandered, sauntered, even around the statue. Shrike wondered if the mortals had erected it as a holy site. Perhaps those who came after dark did so to pay tribute to the hero deified. Yet they did not seem interested in the statue itself. If anything, they seemed very interested in Shrike. The glances had changed from scandalized to intrigued. Their gaze lingered on him, running up and down the length of his figure, fixing not on the peak of his feathered cap or the fur trim of his cloak, but on his visage, and the point where his hose joined in front just below the hem of his tunic. Shrike stared back at them in turn, which seemed more pleasing to them than otherwise, though they sauntered on without speaking to him. One particular stranger in a blue coat, white trousers, and tall black boots passed Shrike by with a very interested glance indeed, and passed him again, and again, before turning back to lean against the plinth as well, an arm's length away from where Shrike stood. Shrike cast a sidelong look at the stranger. The stranger did not acknowledge it. Shrike returned his gaze to the fog, through which Lofthouse would soon arrive. "It's a fine night." Shrike glanced around to see who'd spoken. There was no one nearby save the stranger, who kept his eyes averted. "Aye," said Shrike. The stranger still didn't look at him, but a faint smile graced his lips. "Bit nippy, though." As the season had in fact turned and the Holly King's power waxed in both the fey and mortal realms, Shrike said again, "Aye." The stranger stroked his chin in thought, almost as if to show off the strong cut of his jaw. "Could do with company to keep warm." Shrike said nothing. At last the stranger turned his head to regard Shrike with an approving up-and-down look and a lackadaisical smile. "What say you and I take a stroll somewhere more accommodating?" "Ah, So this was the true purpose of the statue. Shrike felt rather foolish for not realizing it earlier. Still, he smiled as he replied, "You flatter me, sirrah, but my companionship is spoken for." The stranger withdrew at once. "My apologies. Another time, then." Shrike nodded farewell. The stranger tipped his hat. And soon enough, Shrike's patience was rewarded by Lofthouse emerging from the mist. A grin came unbidden to Shrike's lips as he beheld the handsome clerk. The constellations of his freckles more than made up for the lack of stars in London's clouded night sky. Shrike pushed off from the plinth and strode to meet him. "Butcher," said Lofthouse. He looked Shrike up and down as well, with as much or more interest as the passers-by had shown. He bit his freckled lip, and Shrike yearned for the opportunity to kiss him again. "Shall we be off?" "Gladly." Shrike turned to lead the way off the well-trod paths into the particular copse of saplings that held the mushroom ring. Lofthouse followed close behind. Shrike wished he could follow closer still. "Where shall we go?" Shrike asked, halting at the rim of the ring. Lofthouse's dark eyes gleamed with anticipation. "Some place sacred, yet secluded." Shrike held out his hand. Lofthouse clasped it. His palms were not so rough as Shrike's, but his ring finger bore the callus that bespoke his trade. Lofthouse's hand clenched his. Shrike drew him close. Together, they fell into the ring.
That was Gary Furlong reading the 8th chapter of the gay Victorian fae romance Oak King, Holly King. If you liked it, you can hear the complete story wherever fine audiobooks are found. We'll be back next week with more Right Here, Right Queer. In the meantime, thank you for listening.